Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
There is no question that President Donald Trump captured the attention of the press, both leading up to his presidency and during it. But how does it compare to other presidents and their relationship with the press? Is it remarkable or ordinary? Well, throughout history, presidents have battled with the press and used different tactics to control the message ultimately relayed to you, the American voter. Today, we're going to look at these questions, hopefully get some answers, and other discussion points as well. Lance Jackson, my co-host and an educator of 35 years, is the senior resident historian at TrueChat, and will introduce our guest.
Thank you, Justin. Harold Holzer is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. He was appointed to a prominent commission by President Bill Clinton and awarded the National Humanities Medal by President George W. Bush. Harold is the author of the recent book, The Presidents versus the Press. Harold, thanks for taking time to chat with us this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Harold, you open your book and touch on a crucial issue that America continues to wrestle with today. And that's from your book, quote, whether a divided America emboldened the rise of a partisan press or the partisan press widened an existing political gulf. This seems to underpin much of the discussion throughout your book. So where do you come down on this issue?
I acknowledge that I asked the question in the book. I probably never gave a final formal answer because it's still open to historical analysis. But I think if I had to choose one, which you're forcing me to do, I think a divided America emboldened the partisan press rather than the other way around. The country originally divided along fault lines of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, Washington supporters versus Jefferson supporters. And the press was created and encouraged to be created along those party lines. And I think you see the ebb and flow of partisan journalism according to the national mood. Up through the Civil War, we had a two-party press system just as surely as we had a two-party political system. I don't think it caused any divisions. I think it reflected divisions, but it also reflected the cultural acceptance of partisan newspapers. It was just part of the deal in America. And then in the 1890s, that tradition sort of faded and became front-page sensationalist journalism. And now from the 1980s on, we're back to a kind of partisan broadcast media, openly so, just not as honest about announcing whether they're pro-Democratic or pro-Republican, not like they used to do it proudly and openly.
That's really interesting, Harold. You know, it might surprise some of our listeners to learn that George Washington despised the press and yet used it, and many might say even manipulated it. And both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, while different in many ways, both used the Sedition Act to control the press. How did our first three leaders set the stage for the current relationship between the president and the press?
Really, Lance, it's all founded on those examples and those precedents. George Washington had the longest honeymoon ever, like 3.5 years, and he thought he would remain an exalted figure. And then his future successor, Thomas Jefferson, got a Democratic editor to start up an anti-Washington newspaper in the national capital of Philadelphia. And they hounded and attacked Washington for the rest of his term and really up until his death, not only on political issues like whether the United States should favor France or Britain, but also on personal issues. They thought he was too haughty, that he forced people to celebrate his birthday, and on and on. So I blame Jefferson in a way. He not only brought in this newspaper to Philadelphia, he gave its editor a job in the State Department. He was Secretary of State to help him make ends meet. I guess in the whole history of America, though, there's never been an anti-press chief executive like John Adams. As you mentioned, he signed the Sedition Act, which was a federal law that contradicted the Bill of Rights, that which said that freedom of the press is guaranteed. Congress shall make no law impinging on that right, and yet they did. Adams signed it. He enforced it. He staged 17 show trials in which editors were prosecuted and fined and put in prison just for ridiculing the president. So Jefferson opposed it, but only because he didn't believe in federal authority when it could be helped. He was a states' rights man through and through, so he simply wanted states to be tough on libel laws. So all three of our first presidents had rough experiences with the press in the formative years of the Republic, and frankly, they didn't set the best of examples.
When you look at, our first three presidents, obviously two of the three managed to be elected more than once,
Right.
while the middle, John Adams, only managed one term. Do you think, because you sort of talk about it in the book, but do you think that had to do in part with his signing of the Sedition Act, and that the American people were not fond of that idea?
Remember that, we talked about a stacked judiciary today, and giving presidents too much opportunity to appoint federal judges. When Democratic editors went before the judges in the Adams era, all of the judges were Federalists because they'd all been appointed by Washington or Adams. So it was a totally impossible situation. I would love to say that Americans rose up and said, not on our watch are we going to allow opposition newspapers to be silenced. Long live the free press. But it was so equally divided. Democrats wanted Federalist journalists to be muzzled, and Federalists wanted Democratic journalists to be muzzled. And I think we see that even today in our attitude toward things that are posted online. Some people now want censorship or responsibility from media platforms. Others care more about freedom of the press. So I don't think it caused Adams' defeat. I think problems, again, in that England-France situation did.
So throughout the book, you share insight on 19 different presidents. Most got one chapter. A few had to share a chapter, but President Roosevelt got 2 chapters. So how instrumental was he in establishing the press status quo that most of us have come to accept?
Yeah, I have to admit, I did double down on FDR for a variety of reasons. I work at Roosevelt House at Hunter College in New York City, and that's actually the building where Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor lived for the 25 years leading up to his presidency. It's where he gave his first fireside chat the morning after he was elected president. Interestingly, President Hoover didn't concede immediately. So none of what we are experiencing is new. And he lost 41 of the 48 states, and he still didn't concede. Anyway, but also, Roosevelt was president for 12 years and a month. So I thought he deserved 2. And he also faced 2 existential crises in American history, the Great Depression and World War II. So that's why I divided it out. But to answer your question, yeah, he did establish routines that we still follow today. Regular press conferences. Of course, he did 998 of them in 12 years. 998. 2 times a week, almost without fail, except when he was on the road. And even when he was traveling overseas, he did press conferences. But he also did something for the first time that most of the great communicators among presidents have followed. And that is FDR used the best available communications technology to get around the press, to not limit himself to what journalists were saying, and that is radio. He was a radio star of the first order in the same way that Kennedy was a television star and Donald Trump is a Twitter star.
Harold, thank you for sharing that insight, because part of what we're going to look at coming up here is where are we headed, right? Look at the current landscape of what we're experiencing. We've talked a little bit about how we got here, but where are we going? That's what's coming up on The State of Us. We've been talking with Harold Holzer, the author of The Presidents versus the Press. There's more to come. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
We've been talking with Harold Holzer. He's the author of The Presidents versus the Press, about how our relationship, and when I say ours, America's, but also our presidents specifically, how has their relationship with the press over the years developed? And now we get to look at where we're going.
You make the case in the book that President Obama might be one of the harshest censors of all our presidents, yet you also noted that historians ranked him in the top 12 of all presidents in the history of the country after he left office. It seems that many of our presidents our nation reveres, Washington, Lincoln, FDR, and others, were also presidents that sought to regulate the media. Is controlling the press fundamental to being a remembered president?
It's an interesting thought. I believe that there's more to it than controlling the press. I think the most successful presidents are the ones who fed the appetite of the press, the voracious appetite of the press for news, but also developed personalities that were bigger than the press could inhibit. Among them, FDR as a radio and newsreel star, Kennedy, whose televised news conferences became must-see TV in 1961 and 62 and 63. President Obama may have been aloof from the press. He did do news conferences, but as you point out, he went after journalists on the issue of leaks that he thought violated national security interests. So did Kennedy. So there's a parallel there. But I think you've made a good case that presidents, I think it's more the presidents who find alternative communications means than those who battle against the press. And Obama founded the White House website, or at least his administration did. And most of the answers that he wanted to communicate could be found 24/7 on that new White House website.
And you mentioned that multiple times in the book with different presidents, that they captured the audience of the people in different ways, to where the press, whether they had a good relationship with the press or not, the president was able to go directly to the people. So would you say that, as you were saying, so you see that as the key, not so much the relationship with the press per se, or I should say the printed press, but the ability to use some mode of communication to get to the people?
I mean, it doesn't always work this way. Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, two enormously consequential presidents, didn't have good relations with the press. They're still going to be important figures in history, both for positive and negative reasons. Johnson just did not have the personality to romance the press or to make them his buddies, with rare examples. And Nixon, of course, spent his entire career, as Trump has, bashing the press, creating enemies lists, and ultimately being brought down by journalists who went after him on a variety of issues: the Pentagon Papers, the ongoing war, and of course Watergate. So I don't think there's an easy solution here. I think every president who arrives wants to have a decent press operation and wants to have decent relations with the press. And every wise incoming president knows that there will be moments when that relationship is fractured, and it is probably time to make a direct appeal to the American people.
With social media and the 24-hour cable news cycle, is there really any reason for future presidents to worry about their relationship with the print media specifically, or are these new entities just really evolutions of the newspaper?
I hope people can imagine how transformative it was when steam presses were introduced that enabled thousands of copies of a newspaper to be printed every hour. The circulation of the newspapers in the Washington era in the national capital was about 1,200. By the time the Civil War came around, newspapers were printing 100,000 copies, and that was considered revolutionary. So I think you're right. I learned my lesson years ago when I was talking to Arthur Sulzberger Jr. about the New York Times, which he then published. Now he's the head of the corporation and his son is the publisher. And I had known his father, who was the publisher. And I said, how are you going to change the newspaper in the technological revolution to come. And he said, we're not a newspaper. We're a platform. So I think that change has already happened. There are those of us, who are a certain age, like me, who like to read the hard copies of a newspaper in the morning over coffee. But I also read newspapers during the day. I read the Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Daily News and anything else that sends me stories and opinions and sports alerts and analysis. So I just think a newspaper is a different thing now. It's also a 24-hour thing, with a print just something you can settle down with, I guess. And I think they're going to vanish.
I love that analogy because we get the hard copies of newspapers here at True Chat because I'm the one who just has to have them in my hand. Now Justin does too, but our producers who are of a younger generation, we have to teach them how to look at a newspaper because they're not familiar with it at all. So that's an interesting conclusion that you come up with.
It sounds very sad, but you have to bring them along. That's
yes,
my recommendation.
And maybe
I have a son-in-law who's an editor at a newspaper, and he doesn't read the print paper.
So there you go. He's in the business and doesn't read it that way.
Tells you things are changing.
His news that way. Well,
right.
And speaking of the way we consume our news, the last two presidential elections, have certainly highlighted our country's divide. In the age of instantaneous news, tweets, and social media updates, and whatever comes in 2040, as you say, how can each of us navigate the truth to make the discerning decisions to continue to support our democracy?
I think we have to reject platforms that are just too bizarre, too conspiracy focused, too outlandish, too racist, and too provocative. And if we don't think we can do that on our own, I think we're going to see a moment when Facebook and other giant media platforms are going to have the same kind of a reckoning that Democratic newspapers did in the John Adams administration, or Federalist newspapers did in the Thomas Jefferson administration. That is a publisher, whether it's in print or online or in outer space, I don't know what the next wave is, are they responsible, or can you glom it off all on the author and the opinion writer, or even the president? What guarantees of truthfulness does a publisher have to be responsible for?
It's a topic that we've been covering, Harold, on the State of Us now for, it feels like a number of years. And, we've talked a lot about whether or not Americans understand, the extent to which they are ultimately controlled by the information that's available to them. And obviously, in this age of instantaneous information, we'll be careful to call it news because I think that's a discussion in and of itself. Right. Do you feel, because you hinted at, the possibility of legislation. I'm not asking what type of legislation. I'm asking, do you think it is time for our lawmakers to get serious about having the discussion in our houses of government and ultimately coming to a decision about what type of legislation should exist? Because if anything has become apparent, it's that we are not well equipped as a nation to handle what social media has done to change the way we consume our information.
I don't know if it has to be legislative. I think we have regulatory commissions that can get into it. And we have seen Twitter and Facebook posting alerts now, or kind of timid alerts, saying this is not necessarily the truth whenever there's an outlandish tweet. But do you ban? Here's the question: do we ban messaging that says that the government is being controlled from a pedophile pizza parlor in Washington, or that there's a chosen one coming Messiah-like to rescue the country or destroy the country? Part of it is education. I mean, part of it is that we have dropped the ball on civics and government education in this country. We have an incoming senator, I won't say who, but who doesn't know what the three branches of government are. So we have a real problem here in getting people reacquainted with what this government is and what it's supposed to do. And that's as big a challenge as controlling information. I don't want to control information, and I don't think any president wants to inhibit the free flow of information. They just want good news and fair news. As Donald Trump would say when he's talking to newspapermen, we'll see what happens.
Harold Holzer is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. He is also the author of the recent book, The Presidents versus the Press. If you'd like to pick up a copy, you can head to thestateofus.org. We've got links there for you, or anywhere that books are found. It's an excellent read. It's definitely for our history buffs out there a must read. And Harold, we really appreciate you taking some time to join us today.
Justin and Lance, it's been great. This is great discussion. I've done dozens of these since the book came out, and this is really the most interesting, with the best questions. I thank you for it.
Hey, we very much appreciate that. We've been talking with Harold Holzer, the author of The Presidents versus the Press, about how we got to where we are. What is the history that has set up how our presidents interact with the press? And is anything that we're going through really that unprecedented? That's some of what we've talked about, but what's coming up, we're going to discuss, is controlling the press fundamental to being a remembered president? And what about the 24-hour news cycle and social media? How did the 2016 and 2020 elections influence the future of the news media? We've got a lot to talk about. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today we had the opportunity to discuss The Presidents versus the Press. This is a recent book that was just published that Lance and I were fortunate to receive review copies of for The State of Us. We got to talk with Harold Holzer, who's the author today of that book. He's really focused on Lincoln throughout a lot of his career, Lance, but interestingly enough, with this book, he opted to take kind of a very holistic approach, look at the history of presidents, how they've interacted with the press. And to your point earlier in the show, I think it's a very timely piece in we've all kind of questioned, I think, over the, leading up to the 2016 election, right? And over the past 4 years of the Trump presidency, is any of this normal? I mean, because we have a lot of people in the news media, right? This is unprecedented on both sides, because we have the side of, this is unprecedented behavior by President Trump. And then we have the other side that this is unprecedented unfairness by the news media, right? I mean, we've got both. And,
I agree. Yep.
And in both cases, they're really not true, right? They're not unprecedented. Either way, I need an opportunity, Lance, to incorporate our word of the day. And, we had a guest, so we didn't get to talk about it in the first segment. Well, what is, for our listeners at home, what's our word of the day? Maybe you've already used it.
Well, we've used it, but it's the word instantaneous.
Okay.
Meaning done or made or happening in an instant. And it is spelled INSTANTANEOUS.
I have already used it once. I can confirm. I look back at the questions, so got the leg up here. But what was your big takeaway, Lance?
Oh wow, I have three. Well, the one I will give you three. I'll give
What's
you the
your one takeaway? I got three.
Well, you don't get a book like this and grab hold of it. As you said, when I presented it to you, and I had to lobby for it because it was over your reading page level that you like to get. Yeah. But you instantaneously said, before I even knew it, you said, well, I've got it coming. I've contacted the publishers. And I'm like, well, you don't, I didn't think you would do that because it's got so many pages.
It's so long.
But you bam, just jumped right on it. And I just thoroughly enjoyed it. But I think the biggest takeaway is, as you were stating, as we came back for our final segment, and that is, I was sick and tired of hearing on both sides how this has never happened in history before. And I kind of knew that it had, and I could pull up, little anecdotal things, but then I was reading the review of this fabulous book, The Presidents versus the Press, and it just struck home like, here it is. This is not something new, people, and we need to know this as Americans. We need to know this as defenders of democracy and people who stand up for democracy, that not all hope is lost, that gosh, this is horrible and we're never going to recover. No, that's not the case, because this has been a give and take that has existed from the very beginning of our constitutional time with President Washington.
So often I think we get really nervous or scared or upset about things unnecessarily, because the whole point is a lot of times in the past we've been through it and we've been through worse. And it's not to say that what we're going through isn't different in some ways, because I think this goes back to our whole people thinking it's either or, right? We talk about that all the time. This misnomer that is sold to us and pushed by the news media, right? You're either Democrat or Republican. You're either for or against us versus them, right? And on it goes. And I think this also highlights the nature of two things, right? When we say that we've been through this before or that it's not unprecedented, what we're talking about is the president's relationship with the press, right? The way they speak to each other, the demeanor, the behavior, the attitude. Those things are not necessarily new. On the other hand, what we did also talk about at the end of the last segment, and I thought this was really important and stuck out to me, Lance, is when I asked him about, what do we do about social media? Because you and I have talked a lot about the integration of Facebook, Twitter, other social media into people's daily lives, and the way that even the most discerning people, and I hope that I would hope that I could count myself and some of our listeners amongst that crowd. They can even be turned without realizing it by social media, because it's so, it's granular, and part of its granular nature is that you sort of accept it as it comes through, and you get used to it over time. And when I asked him, what do we do? Is it legislation? Is it, his answer was there's regulatory commissions, right, that need to look at this. And I agree with that for sure. But he came back to civics education, right? Because part of the issue is that we don't teach people very often, right, how to find reliable information and how to be aware of what these companies are doing. Facebook, Twitter, and the lot have taken steps recently to flag things, right? But we need to ask the question. We need to be armed to ask the question, is this what we want from companies?
I couldn't agree with you more. And that was my second one. I said I had three. So you hit my second one there. And that is the importance of educating people, and talking about where are you getting your news? And I've shared on previous shows about our discussions in our household, how those algorithms that people with your social media, they just start to feed you the things that you want to read about. And you start to think that, well, that's all there is out there. And we get sucked up into that. And we need to make sure that we're getting those reports from everywhere so that we can be discerned. We can be a discerned listener and consumer of the news and not just information. Because as you pointed out during the show, there is a difference there. As you just stated, it is up to us. This instantaneous media that we live in, where we get our news, and it's just amazing how fast it comes. That, are we up to the challenge? Are we going to fight for our democracy and fight for our news so that no matter how it comes at us? And I thought Harold had a great point. What's it going to be like in 2040 or 2050? It's like, oh, we have this and this is the way it's always going to be. And you can look in history and know something new will come along. And how are we going to deal with it?
Part of the reason that people go to and do not reject the bizarre platforms, part of the reason they spend time on them, and that was Harold's wording there, reject bizarre platforms, right? It's easy to spend time listening to people who are saying things that you want to hear, right? Doesn't matter if it's true or not. If what they're saying is what you want to hear, it is easy to listen to. But America is not about doing what's easy. We are attempting something as a nation that is remarkable as a democracy, to say that we're going to bring together people of all different backgrounds, people of all different ideologies, and try to come up with a government, right, that works for all of us. It may not be possible, right? We're not there yet, and we have to be okay doing what's right, which is often not what's easy.
To that end, we haven't solved all the problems yet. We're working. We are we're in progress here, and that doesn't mean that once we solve these problems, that we're not going to have new problems appear in the future. But that's what's so wonderful when we talk about our Constitution, is that it's a living, breathing document that our founders were farsighted enough to create that still allow us to battle and fight for this constitutional democracy, this constitutional representative form of government that we have. And we've had some stops and starts along the way, and we'll continue to. And that's what's so wonderful about it, is that we're not stuck in anything. We've talked a lot in the last 2 or 3 months that, there are changes we can make. The Electoral College wasn't written in stone. We can make a change to that if we want. The Supreme Court is not written in stone. Do we want to change the way it's formatted? Just two of the bigger issues that we've taken on in the last 3 months, but we take them on all the time. Internal combustion engines were the change that drove mankind to where we are today. But hey, maybe it's okay now to have electric and solar and wind power to create that electricity so that we can, save the earth from the internal combustion engine. That's what America is all about, is taking those challenges and accepting those challenges and finding a solution.
I want to turn to our producer, because we've heard the boomer perspective, a boomer's perspective. I don't want to claim that Lance is representing the entire generation. We've heard it one millennial's perspective. Let's turn, Devin, and you've listened to the whole conversation. You heard what Lance and I said. You were obviously there for the interview. What do you make of all this relationship with the press's influence on the people? What do you think? What would be your message if you're talking to your fellow people in your generation, to other Gen Zers? What do they need to take away from what we've discussed today?
I don't think there's a whole lot I personally would just give out randomly to someone within my generation. But if we're having a conversation about politics, a lot of people have seen a recent video of Trump talking to a reporter that happened on Thanksgiving that a lot of people have brought up to me, and we talk about it. And a lot of people think that a president shouldn't, speak that way to a reporter over a question. But it seems that it's kind of like a double-sided sword. It's the president at some points is all great with the press, and then at any given time it can come back and hit them in the face, and
instantaneous changes, you might say.
Yes, exactly. But I don't think we should exactly listen to all of what the media has to say, but I do think that we should always pay attention to what our president is saying and how they are approaching not only the people of our country, but the press.
And what about, real quickly, we talked to Bradley about this, Lance, I think it was early this year when we did another book where sort of this question had come up, right, about how do you consume news? And I am curious from Devin's standpoint. I know we've talked about this a few times before, and obviously I know that this show has become a big point of consumption for your information. But outside of the State of Us, assuming that we're number one, what other methods of information do you collect? Is it mainly you're seeing stuff that people share through Facebook or Twitter, or do you go to specific sites? How do you stay up to date on what's happening?
So I'm going to be honest, and I'm not much of a stay up to date kind of person on what's going around the world. I know that's probably not the best thing to do.
But you knew about the Thanksgiving stuff.
Yeah, I knew about that, but that's also because other people have talked about it and it got to me. So I guess in a way you could put it that the primary way I receive news, which I always research later just to verify, is from my coworkers, because everyone loves to talk politics there.
And when you do a fact check, and this last point, what verifying the validity of it, what are you looking for? Is this a Google search and then you're seeing, can I find an article from a source that I trust? Or how do you validate the validity of a claim?
So it really depends on what kind of claim it is. I do know that there is there's quite a few fact-checking websites that go over whatever politics, anything political.
They do the legwork.
Yep, they do all the legwork for you. They tell you exactly what's incorrect and what is correct of what was said, but which you can easily Google search for a search engine. You can easily find one of these fact-checking websites. Through Google search, you can just search for fact-checking website, and typically you can have a whole list. I would go through them just to make sure, but typically the first couple options, I always run it through a couple different options before I'm like, okay, well, now I have one. I think it's accurate, but really other than that, I try to look for authors that I know who have backgrounds in this and wouldn't really seem like they would lie. I like to think of them as credible sources. I try to review some of the other things they write as well, just to make sure.
Well, and there's always the opportunity, and that's kind of what we do here, right, on the State of Us, Lance, is solicit those multiple opinions. You don't have to be, we're not suggesting that people at home spend hours researching the validity of a given claim, but if you just take a pause for a second before you hit like or share, read what you just read again, and think about, is everything there? Does it all sound really true? Or does any of that sound a little off or fishy? Because usually people are pretty good at picking out when something sounds like, yeah, I think there's more to the story than what was just said there. But that's what we're trying to do today, Lance, right? Is have one of those conversations that's open and invites the different viewpoints to come into play.
Well, I was just thinking as the Devon creature was sharing his answer, that I always emphasize that here at True Chat, our mission, I always emphasize the part about honest and open and respectful conversations. But today I'm going to emphasize the educate, that we need to educate. And we educated today. We were that civics lesson to talk about people. So, our mission here is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And I think that's the important thing, is that, I always just read the education part and take that for granted. But as the Devon creature said, a lot of times people are just getting stuff on social media. And so we have to educate and bring up other things. He said coworkers talk about politics, but there are other things going on in the world that people need to know about. So today we educated, and I think we continue to also provide honest, open, respectful conversations. And if you liked what we said and you liked the book and the author and the talk, tell your friends about it. Get them to listen to the show, because we do this all the time, and we'd love to have more people listening. And that's the key to us changing and continuing to grow as a nation and make this a better country. If your friends are saying, where can you find us? You can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is released as a podcast Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. in the Eastern Time Zone. We're also a syndicated radio program heard on the weekends in select talk markets around the station. So check your local radio station, see if they carry the State of Us. If they don't, call them up, tell them they should. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, editing producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.